We're very fortunate to have with us Professor Milind Tambe. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Tambe. Professor Tambe is the Gordon McKay Professor of Computer Science and Director of the Center for Research in Computation and Society at Harvard University. Concurrently, he is also serving as the Director of AI for Social Good at Google Research India. Professor Tambe's work focuses on advancing AI and multi-agent systems for public health, conservation, and public safety, with a track record of building pioneering AI systems for social impact. He is the recipient of numerous awards. He received the IJCAI, which is the International Joint Conference in AI, John McCarthy Award, the ACM, Autonomous Agents Research Award, the AAAI Robert S. Engelmore Memorial Lecture Award, and he's also a fellow of AAAI and ACM. He's also a recipient of the Columbus Fellowship Foundation Homeland Security Award, Inform's Wagner Prize for Excellence in Operations Research Practice, the RIST Prize of the Military Operations Research Society, IBM Faculty Award, Okawa Foundation Faculty Research Award, and several others. Professor Tambe has contributed several foundational papers in artificial intelligence in areas of multi-agent systems and computational game theory, for which he's received influential Best Paper awards at a number of premier AI conferences. Professor Tambe's research with this group has often provided the very first use of AI and multi-agent systems algorithms in large-scale societally impactful applications, including those related to COVID-19. Once again, on behalf of everybody here, Professor Tambe, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. And please feel free to get started whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Amulya. Let me share my screen first and make sure everything is working. Okay. So, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you for inviting me, Amulya. It's a great honor. And thank you for all the audience to be here. So I'm going to be talking about our experiences using agent-based modeling and inference for COVID-19. I'm an AI researcher, and so the lessons that I'll talk about are what we learned from an AI perspective in this work. So before I begin, it's important to acknowledge the context that we are in. In the United States, fortunately, the number of COVID deaths and infections seem to be on a downward trend. We are even thinking about opening up things. For example, at Harvard, they are saying that our School of Engineering, we might even return to offices starting in June. However, the situation is quite different in different parts of the world. In India, for example, there's a brutal second wave of COVID-19 infections, 4,000 people, 4,000 deaths a day. In fact, experts are questioning this number and saying that it may be as high as 25,000 deaths a day. The newspaper reports are really heartbreaking, talking about a hell that's out here in 2021. And some looking at the bodies that are floating down the river Ganga are comparing it to what was happening in 1918 in the previous pandemic. So as I speak today, I recognize the heartbreak that's going on in different parts of the world and hope that whereas I'll describe some of the baby steps in the context of what we are witnessing, that in the future, AI will play a more positive role in reducing this heartbreak, and we wouldn't have to suffer as much in the future. So with that, let me begin by talking about some of the research background of my research group of AI for Social Impact. And then I'll start talking about the work we've done with agent-based modeling for COVID. I wanted to acknowledge here Professor Amulya Yadav. I was very fortunate to be his PhD advisor. And so I'm very grateful that, that he's here, and I'll describe some of the work that he did, for which we are both very proud of. So following start of COVID in March of 2020, at least as we felt here in the United States, we've been pursuing agent-based modeling, and I'll outline quickly some of the works that we've done in terms of papers. I'll take a few minutes to outline some of the studies. What I wanted to highlight in the end were some of the lessons that we've learned as an AI researcher getting involved in this fast-moving field. And two members of my research group that I wanted to highlight are Brian Wilder, PhD student, who's a first author in several of these papers, and Andrew Perot, who's a postdoc collaborator and also first author in some of the other papers. And key collaborators, Professor Maya Majumdar, who will be a panelist a little bit later on today in today's program, and Professor Michael Mina from Harvard Chan School of Public Health. So let me begin by providing a background, and it's important to give this background so you understand where we are coming from and what lessons we had come into this field with. So my research team and I have focused on AI and agent-based systems and multi-agent systems research for social impact for the past 15 years, looking at topics of public health, conservation, and public safety and security. The key challenge we focus on is how to optimize our limited intervention resources in these domains. So in terms of previous work in agent-based modeling in public health, the big challenge we've focused on is we have large populations to serve, but limited public health resources. I'll highlight some of the work that we've done with youth experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles next, which led to innovations in social network algorithms. And this is this basically shows that social impact and AI innovation go hand in hand. Second, with respect to conservation, we have large conservation areas to protect, limited number of ranger resources. Concrete example is work we've done in Uganda and Cambodia, where harnessing past poaching data, we are able to predict where poachers set traps or snares, and for the past several years have been able to remove thousands of these snares. The agent-based modeling work that we did here combined game theoretic modeling of interaction between rangers and poachers and machine learning. And previous to that, related to counterterrorism, we've contributed a new model called Stackelberg security games and contributed new algorithms that have been in use by security agencies such as the US Federal Air Marshal Service, the US Coast Guard. So this is actual use of our software in generating patrol routes for the Coast Guard or generating air routes for the Federal Air Marshals and others. So let me talk to you a bit about some of the work we've done in public health, in part to show the background that we bring to the table as we go about agent-based modeling in public health for COVID-19, but also, this is some of the work that Amulya led while he was a PhD student, and I'm really very happy to highlight some of his accomplishments. So this is work. We were at the University of Southern California at the time, and there's a large population of youth experiencing homelessness. 6,000 youth sleep on the streets of LA every night. The HIV rates within this population are 10 times the rates of the normal housed population. We cannot communicate, of course, with every single individual about HIV risk behaviors. So shelters adopt this peer-led approach for HIV prevention. So they'll invite key peer leaders, educate them about HIV, and expect these youth to talk to their friends and their friends to talk to their friends, and information to cascade in a social network in this fashion. This is real face-to-face interactions. This is not happening over Facebook, for example. Now, some of you in the audience may recognize this as the classical problem of influence maximization in social networks in computer science. We are given some social network graph G, and we are trying to choose K peer leader nodes in order to maximize expected number of influence nodes, in order to maximize expected number of youth who will be informed about HIV prevention in our context. We assume here information spreads with this independent cascade model. So basically, we inform a youth A about HIV prevention, and A will talk to their friend B with some probability, and B will talk to their friend C with some probability, and information to cascade in the network in this fashion. I'm not going to go into technical details, but trying to apply standard computer science techniques in this domain of HIV prevention amongst youth experiencing homelessness led to new innovations within this area. Specifically, the social network itself is not known, and therefore we have to sample the social network before we can apply AI algorithms. And so this clever sampling, along with other innovations, led to a newer algorithm called sampling healer, which is what we use in our work. So I'm just going to jump into results. A recent study that we completed and reported just this spring in AAAI Conference 2021 outlined the results of a study with 750 youth. This is work done jointly with Professor Eric Rice of social work at University of Southern California. And as far as we know, the first large-scale application of influence maximization for public health. This is work done jointly with 3 drop-in centers in LA for homeless youth, My Friend's Place, Los Angeles LGBT Center, and Safe Place for Youth. Here we recruited 250 youth in each of the 3 arms of this large-scale study. So one arm was our sampling healer algorithm, another was degree centrality, the more traditional approach of bringing in the most popular youth in order to spread influence, and the third arm, there was no intervention at all. And basically, in each arm, we recruited youth according to the recommendations of that algorithm as peer leaders. And then we waited a month to see what were the changes in behavior of the entire population, including the non-peer leaders. And then at the end of 3 months, again, what were the changes in behavior? I'm just going to give you a quick sample of the results here. So after we selected peer leaders, at the end of 1 month, here's what we see. In terms of reducing HIV risk behavior of condomless anal sex, we see that with sampling healer, there was more than 30% reduction. But with degree centrality, there was no change. And with control group, there was no change. At the end of 3 months, in terms of the change in behavior, degree centrality begins to catch up. But still, sampling healer is significantly better. The main point here is that at the end of 1 month, sampling healer had managed to change behavior much faster. And this is important because this is an HIV risk behavior. And this is a community where people come and go. It's a dynamic community. And therefore, having this behavior change happen faster is important. There are many other metrics that are reported in our AAAI paper. If you're interested, please you're welcome to follow up on that. There are many lessons we learned, particularly with respect to respecting interdisciplinary collaborations. And the other big lesson we came out of this was there was a pace of AI research which was much faster. So we would come up with algorithms every few months in order to publish in the latest conference because of newer ideas. Whereas the field study that was going on with social work took 2 years to complete. And so there was this mismatch in terms of the pace of research, the pace of publications in the AI research versus what was going on with the field study. And you'll see in the work with COVID that tables were turned, and our partners required a much faster turnaround time, and the AI research was much longer. So this was kind of an interesting change for us. So in fall of 2019, we moved from University of Southern California to Harvard. Me and my research group, we were beginning to settle in. We were trying to form collaborations. And that's right then when COVID hit. And I wanted to describe some of our experiences as we started to build up these collaborations and the research that followed. So we got into this agent-based modeling just because that was, COVID was very much on the minds of all of our collaborators in public health that we were talking to. And so I'm going to start by talking about the work that we did first in modeling COVID-19 dynamics. So before I go on, it's important to understand what do we mean by agents here. These are computer programs that simulate individual people. So for example, agent A is an individual with age 47, has diabetes, has no hypertension, and has 2 agents, B and C, in their household. And agent H has different characteristics, and there are millions of such agents in our simulations. Now, when each day we simulate the activities of each of these agents, so we imagine that this agent, agent A, for example, on day 1 is interacting with other agents in its household, but it's also interacting with other agents in its work, at work, community, and etc. And the red here shows an infected individual. The way these contacts happen are determined by contact patterns and so forth from surveys that we have. The sizes of the household are also determined by surveys on sizes of the household in the different communities that we model. So every day we model these interactions and spread of infections, and days go by. And so by day 5 here, we find that agent A has now been infected. Agent D has tested and isolated itself, but there are other interactions that will continue to happen in terms of spreading of infections. So this is how when I talk about agent-based simulations, this is the kind of simulation that is going on in our program. So when in spring of 2020, around March, COVID was just spreading around and Harvard started beginning to shut down. We had contacted Professor Majumdar to talk to her about some other work that we wanted to do with her. We were just trying to explore different collaborations. And it just so happened that the day we were supposed to talk to her was just about the day when Harvard had announced that they were going to shut down. So this meeting actually happened virtually over Zoom. And what Maya suggested was, instead of working on the topic that we were going to discuss, to pivot and start working towards applying these agent-based modeling work towards COVID. And so we came up with this agent-based model that had many newer characteristics compared to other agent-based simulations that were being built for COVID. And it was really surprising the pace at which, in the agent-based area at least, these models were coming around. And so our particular model had families modeled, it had comorbidities, we modeled the age distribution, contact patterns, and Bayesian inference over unknowns, which I'll discuss in a minute. Just to give you a little bit of detail here, there was a contact matrix that modeled the contact pattern among different agents. And we modeled different severity of the disease. And this meant that we needed to infer different parameters as to how patients progressed from mild to severe to critical stages or to the recovered stage. The work was ultimately published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, and it was only possible because there's a whole team working on it, both from Maya's side and from our side. And it was this big team, interdisciplinary team effort that could bring together all of the knowledge in order to make this work be pushed forward quickly. I'll very quickly turn to one of the innovations here, which was in terms of parameter inference. So we wanted to understand, to infer variations in dynamics and progression of the epidemic across different parts of the world. Here, as you can see here, we're looking at Hubei, Lombardy, and New York City. And we wanted to infer R naught for these different places. So these are unknowns that we are trying to infer. And so the way this works is that we have some priors that we have sampled, and then we run our model and try to match the results with the daily trajectory, the trajectory of daily deaths that are known. And based on that, then we refine our priors. And so basically what we get here in terms of R naught for Hubei, Lombardy, and New York City are shown. We see that Hubei, we find lower R naught compared to New York City as we understood those results at the time. And the paper has some policy implications for controlling the second wave. So this was looking backwards in terms of, this was around March of 2020, looking backwards at what were the infection rates. And the next step then was to look forward. This was April of 2020, and different states were planning to lift different lockdowns. And the question was, could we use our agent-based model to predict what would happen if different states change their lockdown processes? So for example, if there was a high contact increase, meaning the lockdown was completely removed, versus medium contact increase, some restrictions, but some reduction in lockdowns. And what we projected was significant increases in numbers of deaths and infections in these states, which appear to ultimately have come about as predicted by our model. And this led to coverage on CNN and other news outlets. The Daily Beast, for example, was collaborating with us on this project, and it reports extensively on questioning different government officers based on the results of our simulations. So we are glad to have contributed to the dialogue on lifting of lockdowns at that time. The key lesson I learned here, among other things, was that we and AI may have had the right kind of tools to model, but Maya knew the right question to ask. Had we not talked to her, we were just fortunate to have talked to her at the right moment, just happened to have a meeting scheduled for some other reason. Had we not done that, then we wouldn't have known what to build. So this expertise of asking the right question comes from our interdisciplinary partners. So the next collaboration that we built up, actually, I just was sending cold emails to my colleagues, was with Professor Michael Mina in Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And at the time, he was talking about this question of there being a range of tests that were entering the market of varying sensitivity and costs. So there's the PCR test we know has high sensitivity, meaning it detects low viral concentrations, but has a high cost and has a slower turnaround. It may take us a day to get the results back. But then there are something like the antigen strip, which requires higher viral concentrations to be detected, but has a low cost, but you get the results back in 15 minutes. And so the question then becomes, if you're a campus like Harvard or Penn State or some other school, and in fact, many schools were testing entire student bodies, all of the students, what is the right testing strategy? Should we use using PCR or the antigen strip? And the challenge here is that, of course, with PCR, for example, schools were could go bankrupt if they required testing of all of the individuals frequently. The result of our study was published in Science Advances. This is also joint work with Professor Glarmore and others. And so, again, we are trying to compare this PCR testing with antigen strips. So we applied our agent-based modeling here to assist in trying to understand the impact of these two different testing strategies. So the way this works is that we're going to test the entire population, and anybody who tests positive, we are going to isolate them. And so if we could run these tests every 3 days, so equal frequency, and if we could get the results back immediately, and then as soon as we get the results back, anybody we see positive, we isolate. On the y-axis here is the total number of infections. If we could run everything frequently and get results back quickly, what we find here is that the more sensitive test is indeed better in terms of reducing total number of infections. However, if there is indeed a day's delay, as is true for the more sensitive test in getting results back, there is a day's delay in isolating an infected individual, then the advantage of the more sensitive test is lost. In fact, it leads to more infections. Furthermore, because of the cost, if we can only run this more sensitive test every 5 days instead of every 3 days, again, the advantage of the more sensitive test is lost. The key conclusion here is that rapid turnaround time and frequency is more critical than sensitivity for COVID-19 surveillance. That is, applying these antigen strips, using these antigen strips is a more powerful weapon in this pandemic rather than relying exclusively on the PCR test. I've learned a lot from Professor Mina, and one of the things he points out is that for public health, we need different weapons in order to control the pandemic and not necessarily apply the same techniques that are used for medical diagnosis. This work was referenced by the World Health Organization, guidance that it gave on testing, and has had extensive coverage in the news media, in New York Times and Washington Post and Time and so on. One day we were thrilled to get up and see Dr. Anthony Fauci discussing our paper. I hadn't anticipated the paper actually being discussed by someone like him, but that was amazing. Great honor. And then, of course, all of this is really intellectually being pushed by Michael, and he has been consulting with the Biden task force. The end result in terms of policy impact of this is approval of at-home tests for these antigen rapid tests. And Michael Mina, as recognized here, has been one who has been calling on federal regulators for almost all of past year, arguing over and over again to clear these rapid antigen tests. And so we're very glad to have played some role by doing our agent-based modeling in helping make that argument computationally to CDC and other agencies. So again, the key conclusion here was that we knew how to do agent-based modeling, but it was Michael who knew what question to ask. Otherwise, we would have struggled. I mean, asking the right question was more important here. The third topic I wanted to cover is outbreak detection. So this is again a topic that's near and dear to our hearts. As we know, we are I'm sure you are too. We are eager to come back to our offices as a research group so that we can work together again. And the question is, we may have on our campuses infections that may be rising. So this is the actual data that we may have on our campuses. The R value might be increasing, infections may be rising per day. However, we may only be able to sample, in this case, this model is only sampling a small fraction of the student population or whoever is at work in a campus. And when we sample a small fraction, there's a question of partial observability. And we get an observed data sample that's, that may look something like what is shown in the green box. So the number of positive tests that are returned per day may look quite different from the actual data that exists on the ground. So on the left is a picture of an actual outbreak, are rapidly increasing, whereas on the right, we don't know, is this really an outbreak that's going on if this is all we get to see? Existing methods from epidemiological literature, for example, are looking for what's on the left in the red box. However, they can't account for partial observability very well, which of course AI techniques are better at. And the question for us then becomes, how do we detect these outbreaks from noisy and sparse data from the kinds of test results that we may get? And this is a question we may face this fall going into the future as we try to monitor the disease from sampling small fractions of a population on campus. So looking at this observed data, this noisy, sparse data, can we in fact infer that R is rising above 1 so that there is actually this growth of infection? So this is work led by Brian Wilder, in which he appealed to stochastic variational inference to draw a posterior distribution. The key challenge here is that there are many, many latent variables between actual case counts, the red box that I showed, and the actual value of R, in the sense that we don't know the total number of daily infections. We don't know when each individual is going to test positive. Exactly who's selected for testing may also be different. And so there's tens of thousands of these latent variables, discrete variables, and this required us to come up with a newer AI model to make this inference. This paper was published in AAAI 21. And what we see here, this is the green line here. So on the x-axis are days, on the y-axis is value of RT. This is R varying per time. The green line is the actual value of RT, how it's increasing. And you can see at day 20, it changes and goes above 1. The orange line is the state-of-the-art models trying to infer the value of R. And we can see from this orange line that they missed the green line entirely. Whereas the GPRT, this new tool that we've come up with, a probabilistic tool, we can see that it tracks this value of R much more closely. So tracking and responding to epidemics will require new AI methods. This is really opening up a new research direction for AI researchers. And I anticipate that there'll be a lot of follow-on work here because it's an important topic, but requires also an advance in AI. And I hope people will follow up on this type of work because it's really relevant to where we are going. Essentially, the challenges of partial observability with a very large number of latent variables. And so we've come up with our own method, but I'm sure there's much more to be built on top of this method. I'll quickly go over some of the other works that we've done. This was work done, cohort modeling, as part of our work with Google Research India. And so this is in the fall of 2020, when in different parts of India, for example, in Mumbai, they started thinking about starting up the suburban trains. And so the question, I mean, the trains had been shut down. Obviously, people were suffering due to the lockdown. It was important to open up. And the question was, what was the right way? This work is led by Alok Talekar and a whole team from University of Virginia and others at Google Research India and Indian Institute of Science. So the key idea that we tried to model here was cohorts. So you could imagine there's different groups of travelers. For example, one group of travelers going from Churchgate to Dadar, another group going from Marine Lines to Bandra. And the basic idea here was that each cohort would stay together from source to destination, and they would stay in one particular compartment of the train. And in this way, we try to avoid infections being spread. So this is the way this would work. You can imagine that there's a cohort traveling from, say, Dadar to Mahalakshmi, one other cohort traveling from Dadar to Mumbai Central. So they all are in different parts of the train, and they travel together, they enter the station together, and they travel together. And then at the entrance to each station, there's some screening. And if any member of a cohort is found to be symptomatic, then the entire cohort is then quarantined. So this as work, as I said, was published in AMAS 2021, which just concluded last week. And what we showed here is, if indeed we follow this cohorting idea, this was obviously, the work was done in October, the paper was presented recently, that the orange line, as we can see, reduces the total number of infections. A key conclusion here was that we presented this work to policymakers in fall of 2020. They decided that they didn't want to follow this approach. And perhaps given what is going on today, one would conclude that perhaps a more cautious strategy should have been adopted for opening up trains. But this is what we noticed from our interactions with the policymakers at the time. There was further study I wanted to draw your attention to. This was again work with the same team with University of Virginia and others, where we looked at mobility flow reduction at state level in India due to the different lockdown policies. The key lesson here that I learned is that this research, we were used to thinking about our agent-based modeling. I mean, we had been working at a fairly rapid pace for our taste, but we were thinking about, okay, what do we want to change in terms of AI modeling and so on and so forth. But there's so much work going on all over the world in terms of mobility, and there's so much mobility data being published and so on, that by the time we got around to actually completing this work and trying to publish it, there were others who had already moved forward. And so this was an interesting shift from the kind of work we had done in the past, where the AI side was much faster and the public health side was slower. Here, the tables had turned, and we realized that things really needed to move much, much faster. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly go through some of the other work that are ongoing under submission. So for example, decentralized policymaking. I mean, clearly this was much more relevant perhaps earlier, where there were different policies being recommended at different levels of the government, from federal level to state level to a county level. So that meant there were perhaps clashes in terms of the policies that were recommended in terms of how to control infections. And this was cast as some kind of, this is cast as some type of a hierarchical game, trying to understand what kind of equilibrium gets reached if different levels of the government recommend different policies. Another area of work we investigated was risk-based quarantine. So rather than the policy that anytime anybody tests positive, to quarantine them for 10 to 14 days, the basic idea here was to when a person tests positive, to look at, to monitor for a couple of days the cohort that particular individual has shown here. Agent A has tested positive, they're isolated. However, their contacts B, C, E, and D, who normally would also be quarantined, are instead monitored on day 6. And if none of them show any symptoms, then on day 8, they're released. This was a simulation study we did, trying to check what the impact would be. It led to 40% fewer quarantine days with not as much increase in number of infections. So this is a ongoing simulation study, and something to be investigated in the future. So I wanted to end here and talk about some of the lessons that we've learned from this work. Clearly, interdisciplinary research is important in this context of agent-based modeling in COVID-19. We as AI researchers may have tools to help, but we don't know what questions to ask that are relevant. And I point this out to my students that in this instance, for example, Michael Mina had the right question. We may have had tools. And of course, Michael did a lot of additional work to support his case, but we just didn't have any clue to the right question to ask about the kinds of tests, the rapid antigen test versus PCR. I mean, this is not a question we would have come up with. And as such, the amount of AI innovation was not as much, but the impact was much greater because it was the right question at the right time that got asked. There are, of course, newer AI research challenges that have come about, as I mentioned, with the detection of outbreaks and partial observability. The pace of AI research, I've been used to a situation where the pace of AI research is much slower, and pace of AI research versus our collaborators, there's a mismatch, but it was usually that we wanted to publish faster because we had newer algorithms and testing things out in the field was slower. Here, tables were turned. And so this is something that we had to adjust to. Not every question that got asked succeeded in publication or policy impact. So I mentioned to you the work with respect to modeling of cohorts in trains and others. And there were other questions where we investigated, but so it's not the case. So there's obviously still a hit and miss type of situation. I'm hopeful that what we've done in all of this is seed new interdisciplinary collaborations between AI and public health. And I foresee a future where these disciplines come together so that we have a whole new set of trainees that come together and answer these questions. There are newer conferences that are now popping up in this space. And so I hope this will lead to a whole new area of work, given what we've all gone through and are still suffering through. It is a very important area for us to look at in the future. And I'm hopeful, at least in my research group, that we will be able to build in this area. And I hope that we can persuade others to join. It's really too important to not be working in this area now. Finally, in this area, as with others, when we work in this area of AI for social impact, we have to understand that lack of data is the norm and should be part of our project strategy and shouldn't be an obstacle that, since there is no data, we're just not going to work on it. So this is with respect to, for example, the partial observability and detection of whether there's an outbreak on campus. Partial observability, lack of data, that's often going to be the AI question, AI research question to answer. So I'll stop here. I know I've exceeded my time, but thank you for inviting me. And if you wanted to follow me on Twitter, that's my handle. So thank you. And I'm happy to take a quick question or two, Amulya, and then hand it over to you back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Milind, for that wonderful and inspiring talk and for all the work that you've done. We have one question from Rinkat Goel. Can you slightly elaborate the technology framework used to develop these agent-based models, especially because of the large number of parameters that are considered?
So when you say technology that's built, I mean, agent-based simulations is something that we've been doing for past, many years. I guess I've been involved in agent-based modeling and simulations since 1990s. The particular techniques continue to evolve, but essentially you are really modeling each individual. The basic idea here is each individual gets modeled as a individual with particular characteristics. So in this case, age and health conditions and family that they belong to. We model the fact that they interact with other individuals at work. And of course, in this case, we are interested in spread of the epidemic. So what we are trying to model more effectively are the interactions and not other details that are not particularly relevant for spreading of this disease. And so, I mean, I hope that answers somewhat the question that was asked. And then there is the question of inference of unknowns. So basically R naught and so forth. And as I showed, the way we do this is by doing this type of Bayesian inference. Let me see if I can go back. That may take me some time to go back to the actual slide that I have on this. Let's see if I can go there. But hopefully, that may remind you of what we were trying to do here. So this is the way this works. We sample priors and then run the model and try to match this trajectory of reported deaths. And that allows us then to come back and figure out the right kind of values for these unknown parameters, the start time of the infection, the infectivity, and so forth. And so that is the way this model gets run. Hopefully that gives you some sense of what's going on, but there's of course the paper that has much more detail if you're interested in following up on that.
I guess one way in which this question can be inferred, at least my reading of the question was that since, as you mentioned in your summary slide, that lack of data is the norm, right? And so since we don't have as much data for COVID-19, it's only been a year, and there have been many different kinds of models for modeling the spread of COVID-19. Some are agent-based, some are not agent-based, right? In epidemiology, you have these differential equation-based SEER models, which don't require as many parameters to be estimated as compared to agent-based models, where you're trying to so grant, it's definitely the case that you will be able to draw richer inferences with agent-based models because of the additional things that you do model. But given that there's less data that we are working with, I mean, how does this trade-off play out, that you want to model these additional things which do play an important role, but in doing that, you have to estimate new parameters. You have to, find out values of new parameters that you just don't have the data to work to estimate well.
No, I no, that's a very interesting question, and of course there are these different settings, and very early on, for example, Maya did this work when there was very little data available, and used tools that just based on very limited amount of data try to infer the right kinds of parameters that are needed. And so the agent-based models and simulations come in at a later stage, because earlier we're just trying to understand what are the parameters. Later on, when we want to actually make policy recommendations, that's when agent-based models become useful, because in order to make policy recommendations, you have to understand counterfactuals. What would happen if you implement a certain policy versus implementing some other policy? And there are obviously these inference techniques, and we have to further develop these inference techniques in order to make them better. But without these agent-based models to actually model policy recommendations, at least fine-grained policy recommendations. I mean, we've tried to work with the simpler differential equation-based models, and then it becomes very difficult to model these fine-grained policy recommendations. For example, in our PNAS article, we point out if you shelter in place not the entire populations, but individuals between ages of 40 and 60, for example, what would happen? So rather than necessarily saying anyone above a certain age are all to be sheltered, which was often done, we require sort of odd even type of interaction, so that half the population would shelter voluntarily, another half would go to work, etc. These types of flexible policies were difficult for us to model using these other tools, and agent-based models allowed for that type of flexibility. So it's an important and interesting trade-off, and I don't think we know enough. And in talking to our epidemiological friends, what we found is that there's a certain affinity to the simpler models, but what I understood from them is also in part because, AI researchers, agent-based modeling researchers have not essentially interacted. We just haven't formed these kinds of interdisciplinary collaborations as much. And I'm hopeful that as we go into the future, these collaborations would allow us to push some of these models. I'm not in favor of trying to push them down the throats of our collaborators when in the beginning, right at the start of the epidemic, for example, when there's very little data available. But as time goes by and we start asking what are the policy recommendations we want to give, this just agent-based modeling seems like a much better tool. It allows for all this flexibility. So that we can come up with finer grained policy recommendations that are less burdensome for the population, that allow for less suffering for people. And so it's important to develop this tool.
So I think in the interest of time, we need to stop there. There's a follow-up question by Rinkaj Goel in the Q&A. So if you want, you can answer that. Perhaps
I can take it offline. I don't want
to
derail your program. So
sure,
thank you again for inviting me. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome.